All right, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the size of a data table and trying to find the last row of that table. This is going to be a pretty short lesson. I do recommend that you don't stress too much about how complicated the code that we're about to write is. It happens to be a line that I simply memorized when I first started out without trying to fully understand every little last piece of it, because it gave me the ability to start doing some cool stuff without being held back by the fact that this is just a tricky step. So just create some data. It could be any number of random things. And let's say that our user, there's some table that we're working with here, right? And we know that our data starts here. So we've got some headers. Headers are very common. That usually says where my table starts and, kind of identifies the data. And then below the header, we might want to interact with the data set starting in the first row of data. So we've got, number 6 here is the row that we're starting in. And we're going to say for every row in this table, let's do something. But we can't do that meaningfully if we don't know where the table stops. What a lot of people will do is they'll say, well, just go until I find a blank cell. That seems like a good idea. But what would happen if I had a randomly blank row? Well, then unfortunately, we would stop early. We would stop in row 9 when in reality, we also had data in row 11. So I don't recommend using that method. I think that it will hurt you down the road at some point, especially if you're writing a macro for another user. They're not going to understand what happened when they happen to have a blank row. So my approach is that I say, okay, well, why don't we go down to the bottom of the sheet, which is row 1,048,576, and then go all the way up to the first non-blank cell. That way, if I had any blank rows of data anywhere in my table, it would always find the very last row. So go to your VBA editor with Alt F11 and then create a module if you haven't already yet. Make sure that you're working within a .xlsm workbook. Call your procedure sub, find last row. And now we're going to say dim last row as long. Again, long is a positive or negative whole number. You're never going to have a row that's something like 1.5, so working with whole numbers is totally fine here. Type last row equals, and then here we're going to type cells, rows.count. Again, don't stress about not understanding all of this, but rows.count is counting how many rows exist within a certain column. We're going to say which column to count. For our example, let's count C. And then we're going to say .end, which is the property to go to the very bottom of that column. XL up brings us up to the first non-blank cell. And at this point, what we have here is an object. This is an actual cell. We don't want to make an object assignment, so we don't want to say that C11 is our last row, because we want to extract 11 as an actual number. So we're going to type .row to extract that specific property, which is the number 11, and assign it to the variable last row. I'm going to hit F8, and I'm going to run it one line of code at a time, and it's going to count and find the number 11. Hit F8 once and one more time, and now you see 11 as an assignment has been created. Now, just to show you how this works in action, let's go ahead and copy this last row, paste it in the next row, so as to prove that when we create an additional entry of data here, it's going to correctly count that the last row has now gone down to 12. Drag your execution arrow up 1, hit F8, and now that you see that it's 12. I like to use this as a starting point of how to count rows. If you want to be specific, you can type which sheet on which to count the rows. So you can say sheet 2. And then that way, as you navigate your way to different sheets, you're always being very explicit as to where you're counting your columns and rows and identifying the size of your data. Now you can also find the last column by typing sheet 2.cells. You can, for example, we want to find out how many columns of data we have, and let's say that we know that our headers are in row 5. So we can kind of flip this and type 5, and then columns.count, .end, XL2 left, .column, If you were to pull this up and hit F8, you are now going to get column 5. So we know that our last row is 12 and that our column is 5. Okay? It's very common that people are going to add data to the right and to the bottom of your table. Usually we can rely on the upper left corner being kind of immutable. If you designed your data table right, I think that's how most people like to use their Excel workbooks, is that the data that starts here is going to stay there, and it's going to grow this way, and it's going to grow this way. All right, thanks for joining this lesson, and we'll see you soon.